this is Austin from The Body Curious, and today I'm going to be doing a little bit more about ancient Western medicine. And to start off with, I'm going to use a base which some people have already kind of heard of, which is the Greek idea, which is known as the four humours, which was very popular up until about the early 1900s, and actually parts of it you may even recognise. And this is a good base to start off from in understanding the influence around ancient Western medicine. And this is the Greek idea created by a guy called Empedocles. And the principles are this. We start off with the four elements. We've got fire, earth, air, and water. And what you have here is this is supposed to represent the world as we stand, and this can be applied either to food, the seasons, personalities. And the idea was that these four elements, when combined correctly, roughly stood in the middle here. And this created the fifth element, or was regulated by the fifth element, known as either pneuma or ether, depending in which language you spoke, and that meant the breath of life. So the idea was that the balance of these four elements, you then had the fifth, which is perfect. Now we can see this in terms of the types of ideas surrounding these four elements. So fire was considered as being hot, unsurprisingly. And earth was considered as being cold. Air was considered as being dry. And water, wet or moist. And yes, I realise that people aren't allowed to use the word moist anymore without sniggering. So if we applied that to the idea of the seasons, in terms of the idea of this was the pathway of the sun. So this area here was considered to be the solar part, shiny sun, and the lower half was considered to be the lunar part, the moon. And each one has the influence, so plus sun plus moon. And then with regards to the seasons, you have the influence of water and fire, so that meant it is hot and moist, so that would be spring. And then you had hot and dry, summer. Cold and dry, which would be autumn. And cold and wet, winter. And this makes sense, doesn't it? And it was said that actually any imbalance would need to have the opposite effect on the system. So in other words, if when you're cold and wet, you actually need to influence it by having something dry and hot to get you back into balance, which makes sense. You know, you make a nice fire out of either coal or wood, getting you from being cold and wet and bringing you somewhere in the middle to be balanced again. Conversely, if you get sunburnt, in other words, your system is too hot and dry, you would need to introduce something cold and wet to balance that out. Something, say, like aloe vera or a nice cool drink. That makes sense, doesn't it? Most of it is very practical, and it makes sense even now because we're speaking in the European think, which is quite different than, say, the way in which, say, Ayurvedic thinks, or the way in which Chinese medicine thinks. Doesn't mean to say they're wrong, it just means that the way we think in the Western world has different ways of looking at the world, which doesn't necessarily correlate with ideas that would be very common and understood in either Chinese thought or Asian thought. So when it came to personality, or in terms of how diseases would affect us, then it was said that if you had a type that was hot and wet, it was said to be called sanguine, which comes from the Latin word for meaning blood, because blood is hot and wet. People who are hot and dry were said to be choleric. And we have this still in a lot of the languages, such as, say, the Latin type languages. So en colère, as in to be angry. And so that meant the person was too hot and dry. There was no fluid inside them. They were too. That doesn't mean to say someone who's choleric has to be angry. It just means that it's the type that was influencing them more. In the area of where it was said to be cold and dry, this was said to be melancholic, which we still use today as in terms of melancholy. And if you were said to be a cold and wet type, this was said to be phlegmatic, as in phlegm. Right backwards, you know. So these were said to be the types and also the influences that would have on you. So if you were naturally someone who is quite vibrant and full of energy and full of beams, spring-like, then the idea was that when spring happened, that's a double influence. In other words, if that's your natural type, and then you came into spring, it's kind of like a double whammy on the system. And that can mean that you need to kind of bring yourself back into balance to reduce that energy type by introducing things that are a bit more cold and dry. And this would be done through nutrition, so foods. So different foods were said to be one of these types too. And the aim was, when it came to health and well-being, is to aim to get your system back into balance. None of these types are negative or positive. They are just simply influences on the system from the ancient Greek point of view. And so as an example, we'd find that we naturally do this kind of anyway. This is why this system is quite easy to follow, is that when on a summer's day, actually we prefer cold and wet things to bring us back into balance, whereas on a cold, wet day, we actually need something dry and warming to bring us back into balance. Conversely, if things are too cold and dry, we actually need to introduce fire and water. And this is, if you think about it, the nature of alcohol is actually often called in certain cultures fire water. And so there is this element of where certain types of things that we necessarily think of as being, oh, is that good for us or bad for us? It very much depends on what suits your type first. So it's not necessarily a way of thinking it as being negative, but if someone is suffering from melancholia, particularly in the autumn and winter months, is that actually we need to introduce the idea of sunshine in the system. And this is where, from the ancient Greek point of view, you would introduce things like, say, mead, which was a form of alcohol made from honey. And this would be a form of fire water. So you'd introduce certain amounts medicinally to bring the system back into the centre by introducing hot and moist foods or drinks, one of them being a form of alcohol. As I've already mentioned, if you are sunburnt, then they would use things like aloe vera to cool down the system because it was wet and cold. Other types of foods that are wet and cold would be things like cucumbers and salads. These kind of things are natural to us because we kind of innately know what works and what doesn't. And the physicians of the time understood this and were great observers of what worked and what didn't work. They were very practical. And this is why this system is very easy to understand from the way we think in Europe, is because it's somehow not really that new, because it was around for about 2,000 years from the turn, the pinnacle of the Greek Empire all the way up, and it still has influence even today. So this is known as the idea of the four humours, and was particularly prevalent, and characters such as, say, physicians known as Paracelsus and also even Culpeper throughout the centuries were using this model, and it worked very well and still actually works very well today as a base for working off what we'll be talking further and further along when it comes to ancient Western medicine. Cheerio!